All right, today we're going to talk about embryophyte reproduction in more detail than we talked about in the last lecture. So to review our different taxonomic groupings within the embryophytes, we have the seedless vascular plants, the bryophytes or mosses, and marchantiophytes or liverworts. We're just going to focus on bryophytes in order to look at their reproductive structures and processes in more detail. And then when we have the advent of vascular tissue, our next groups that evolve are, and we find still on the planet today, are the pteridophytes or ferns and the lycopodiophytes. So we have a couple examples of pteridophytes and lycopodiophytes. We're just going to look at the true fern life cycle, but we're also going to look at reproductive structures in some of the other types of fern-like plants and seedless vascular plants. Then we have the evolutionary innovation of pollen and seeds, and that's a major change in what happens to the gametophyte. So we're going to look at a very, very brief introduction to what happens with pollen and seeds today, and briefly look at what that looks like in pine and cycads, and then briefly look at what a flower and what a fruit are, and that those are the evolutionary innovations in the magnoliophytes. But we'll come back to those in much, much more detail in next week's lab. So the key factor in all of this understanding of reproductive structures is to be very clear in your mind the alternation of generations life cycle. I have a separate short video that goes through the steps of alternation of generations for mosses and ferns, so you should check that out. So when we look at the life cycle, though, we see that where we have meiosis and fertilization, we have haploid organisms above that line and diploid organisms below, that we're going to have meiosis producing spores. The spores are going to grow by mitosis into multi-celled individuals. Now these individuals may have separate sexes, where we have a male gametophyte on a separate individual than the female. So we may have both male and female reproductive structures on the same individual as well. It just depends on the type of plant. But the body structure that's going to make the sperm is going to be called the antheridium. And the body organ that is going to make the egg is going to be called the archegonium. Notice that it has egg right in there. The archegonium is where the egg is made. And the antheridium, if you know flower parts, the anthers are the male pollen producing structures in the flower. So you can remember which one is which. So we're going to have this sperm and egg getting together, fertilization occurs, forms a zygote, grows into a multi-celled individual by mitosis. But what happens that's unique in embryophytes is that growing embryo is basically still sitting in the body of the female gametophyte, and it's going to grow up out of it. So we're going to see that these two kinds of individuals, the gametophyte and the sporophyte, are actually physically connected to one another. And that the sporophyte may wither and die after it's made the spores, depending on the life cycle, or the gametophyte may wither and die. And the sporophyte is the one that survives longer. So that's going to depend on what kind of plant we're looking at. So the structures that are going to make the spores are called sporangia. And sporangia are very tiny. Sporangia are not going to be something you can see with your naked eye, but they occur in clusters or clumps. And so we're going to sometimes be able to see a clump or a cluster of sporangia that are inside of a larger body organ. And so we're going to look at those body organs in our seedless vascular plants, and they have different names and slightly different appearance depending on what taxonomic group they're in. So we're going to learn a few of those today. All right, so when we look at moss, the little green fuzzy individuals that we're seeing down here, those are the gametophytes. And the sporophyte is going to grow up out of the body of the top of the mom from the egg, fertilized egg. And so this stalk and this capsule are actually the sporophyte, and it's growing up out of a gametophyte. The capsule is going to be the structure that's going to have the sporangia inside of it. So those sporangia are inside the capsule. That means the spores are made inside the capsule. And when we look at this plant, we say, aha, that is the reproductive structure. So think for a minute about why it's nice that this reproductive structure that's making the spores is on this long stalk that's coming up out of the top of our tiny little moss. When we go out in the world looking for moss, we may not see these sporophytes at all times of the year. Just like flowering plants only have flowers sometimes, these sporophytes are only going to be present on moss sometimes. So we have some microscope slides today in order to look at the structures that are part of this moss life cycle. And so we have a slide of the longitudinal section of the capsule. You can see the spores are inside there. We looked at some live mosses last week in lab. And then we're going to look at cross or longitudinal sections again of male and of female, the very tip top of the body of the plant, as is shown here. Now we have separate sexes in moss, and we're going to be able to see by looking at these structures if it's kind of oblong and it sort of looks like a corn dog filled with little dots. That's an antheridium, it's making sperm. And if we have these sort of bowling pin shapes, we're going to have this wider part at the bottom, and inside of it is going to be an egg cell. On any one section of archegonium, you may not see a whole egg, you may not see more than one. There isn't going to be a nice row of them. You have to look at the slide fairly carefully in order to spot those. Right, so there's a couple examples on the lab slides for you to make sure and see one. All right, turning our attention now to the vascular plants, our true ferns is going to be our example of the life cycle of seedless vascular plants. So the life cycle, not only is vascular tissue different, but the life cycle of seedless non-vascular plants compared to seedless vascular plants. So we have the same alternation of generations, except what the sporophyte and the gametophyte look like are quite different. It turns out that the big leafy sort of fern-like individual is actually the sporophyte in the fern life cycle. Remember, it was the gametophyte in the moss life cycle. And that when we look at the back of the fern leaf, sometimes we're going to see on them these brown dots, right? So it's a cluster of sporangia. That means that it's a group of them together. And the name of this structure of the group of sporangia is the sorus. So the sorus, or sori, if there's more than one of them, which there always are, is going to be the place that produces the spore. So we know that there's these sporangia on the backs of the leaves of the fern that makes the fern the sporophyte. The spores are released, they're going to grow a teeny tiny little plant leaf that is going to be heart-shaped. We have some of these on slides to look at. And there's going to be an archegonium and an antheridium. Sometimes they're on the same individual, sometimes different individuals. And we're really only going to be able to tell by where they are. So if we have these little body organs that are close to this sort of V part of the heart between the lobes, those are going to be the archegonium. And where we have the antheridia are going to be more in this region of the bottom shape, bottom part, the tip of the heart. So we just need to look at where they are to tell which is which. All right, and when we have the baby sporophyte growing up from the gametophyte, it's the gametophyte that's going to die and wither away. And that very first little leaf of the young sporophyte, it doesn't look like a fern. It looks like a tiny little cilantro leaf. So that's what you want to look for in your in those slides. All right, we have a couple other examples of seedless vascular plants. So this horsetail, this structure at the very tip of the stalk here, this is now all of the seedless vascular plants are going to be sporophyte dominant. So we're going to find some sporangia bearing structure. And in the case of the horsetails, the equisetum, we have this cone-like structure at the top of the stalk, and it's called a strobilus. All right, so our strobilus is our spore-producing structure in the horsetails. And we have slides of what these structures look like for each of these groups. In the whisk ferns, Psilotum, right? So they have these clusters of sporangia. And if we look inside of them, they don't have as much complex structure as the cones do of the strobilus. So basically, we just say that this is a sporangia. So this is actually 3 fused sporangia. Isn't quite fancy enough to be called a strobilus. When we look at Lycopodium, we have a couple examples. We have Selaginella. Now, the cone, there's a strobilus on Selaginella, so it also has a strobilus. And we're going to find it at the very tips of the stalk. So if we had a strobilus here, we would find it at the tip, and that we're going to see it also has a cone-like structure. This is a sporophyte, and so it's going to have spore-making structures inside of it. Lycopodium, in this picture, you can also see it has this stalk with this structure sticking up out of the top. That's going to be its reproductive structure, and once again, it's called the strobilus. So when we get to the seed plants, they not only have seeds, they have pollen. And when we look at what happens with the sporophytes and the gametophytes, we look at the moss life cycle, it was gametophyte dominant. But when we look at the fern life cycle, it's sporophyte dominant. So the gametophyte has actually become reduced compared to those earlier life cycles in the evolutionary history of plants. And we see when we make the transition to seed plants that the gametophyte has become even further reduced, right? And in both the pine and in lily, our example of a flowering plant, we don't even see the female gametophyte as a separate individual that's going to have some life outside of or separate from the mom. Right? We do see that the male gametophyte does have a separate existence from the mother plant, but it's very teeny. It's only 2 cells, and we call this thing pollen. So pollen is 2 cells that are wrapped in a little outer coating of sporopollenin, and it is the male gametophyte. Right? So when our seed plants go through meiosis, if they're going to make male offspring that are going to be make pollen producing, then they're going to be made from a structure called a microsporangia. It's going to make microspores. And then we also see on the body of the adult that we can have megasporangia. And megasporangia are going to make the megaspores. And the megaspores are going to grow up to be the female gametophyte. Right, so we have this separating out of 2 kinds of spores. So the fact that we have a megaspore and a microspore means we have a condition called heterospory, different kinds of spores. We only have 1 kind of spores like we did in the mosses and ferns. It's called homospory. That is, they're both the same, right? So we're going to find this meiosis happening to produce the pollen. It's going to be in a pollen cone. If it's a cone-bearing plant, it's going to be in the anther on a flowering plant. So the pollen is going to be released, and it is the male gametophyte, and it is only 2 cells. So when we say that we have a reduced gametophyte as we go through the evolution of land plants, we've gotten it down to pretty small. All right, so if we're looking at this body of the sporophyte, we're going to find somewhere in there, not just the anther, but we're going to find basically a structure called an ovule. So the ovule is a lot like the uterus in mammals, and the megaspore is going to be inside of this ovule. it's going to divide 3 times, and that is going to produce an 8-cell female gametophyte that's going to stay in the ovule. One of those cells is the egg. And the egg is going to be held there inside the ovule. And fertilization is going to involve the sperm coming to the body part of the female plant. And so the sperm is actually going to be able to get released from the pollen grain and make its way to the egg on the body of the female plant. So this is going to happen either in the flower or in the cone. All right, so the fact that pollen can go outside into the environment and doesn't have to be in water. All right, if we think back to our ferns and mosses, they are actually producing sperm in those antheridia. They're not producing pollen, and those sperms have little flagella, and they actually have to swim in water in order to get to an egg. So it has to be a quite moist environment for reproduction to happen in the non-seed plants. But once we get the advantage of pollen, it can be out and about in a completely dry environment, and it gets moved to the body part of the female and delivered. All right. So that means that when we invent in evolutionary history pollen and seeds, we become able to have completely terrestrial reproduction. Right, so instead of being like an amphibian that has to have water in order to do reproduction, our seed plants are like lizards that evolved the amniotic egg that allows them to do reproduction completely separated from a watery environment, right? Not only do they have the ability to have terrestrial reproduction, completely terrestrial, but they have internal fertilization, because the pollen grain actually delivers the sperm straight to the body part of the female that's still holding the egg inside of it. So we have internal fertilization. All right, so fertilization occurs still inside the ovule. The zygote is formed inside the ovule. The developing embryo is inside the ovule. And what happens is that there is a protective structure on the outside of the ovule. And the ovule itself, containing the embryo inside of it, turns into the seed, right? So the ovule turns into the seed, and then in the cone plants, the seed can then finish development and gets released from the cone. And then in the flowering plants, that develops inside the ovary of the female plant, and it stays inside the ovary. The ovary develops into a fruit, and so the ovules are inside of, the ovule turns into the seed, the ovary turns into the fruit, and you end up with a fruit with seeds in it, right? And so that is the reproductive process in the seed and pollen plants. It's more complicated than the ferns and mosses. All right, so when we look at what kind of structures we see out in the real world, we're going to have a kind of a, in the cone plants in pine and in cycads, we're going to see that there is a cone, a structure that's like our strobilus, that is going to be the place where the pollen is made. And we also are going to have these ovulate cones, or these female cones, that are going to be the ones where the eggs are and the seeds are going to get made. So we have ovulate cones. Now it takes a long time to grow these cones. So they're going to start out as a teeny little nub, and this little guy up here is an example of a female ovulate cone. And that is going to get, if all things go well, pollinated. So some pollen's going to fall on there. And then the cone is going to sort of seal itself up, and the development of those seeds is going to continue sometimes for 2 or more years. While the female is transferring nutrients to them, the seeds are becoming provisioned in order to take on life outside on their own. And then eventually when the seeds are ready to be released, the cone opens up and the seeds drop out. So those are the female cones. The male cones are typically much smaller, and the pollen cones are going to be these sort of little caterpillar looking things. This is zoomed in. Notice the size of the leaves here. So these pollen cones are actually smaller than those first year ovulate cones are. So we don't necessarily find them on the tree at the same time. Usually the plants have some mechanism to try not to pollinate themselves. All right, so if you've never noticed these pollen cones before, we have some examples for you to look at. So we look in a little more detail at the life cycle diagram just for pine. We see that we have the sporophyte is going to have these male cones on it that are going to make the pollen. They've got microsporangia, they're going to make the microspores, which are the pollen grains. We have a slide of what pine pollen looks like, as well as a slide of the pollen cone. And we have the ovulate cone. We're going to look at the slice down inside the cone, and you can see where the ovules are. So the pollen grains are actually going to drop down in between the scales, and they're going to land in a place where the sperm can then get straight to and fertilize the egg as it's growing there inside the meatophyte on the scale of the pine cone. Right? Each scale of the pine cone is going to have two ovules on it actually, and so there's going to be two seeds that are growing on the top of each of those cones. And an example of what those look like is pine nuts, in fact, are the seeds of pine trees. There's a couple different species. There's a Mediterranean stone pine, which is where we get our sort of Mediterranean history of using pine nuts in food. And there's also a pinon pine, the one that's here in the United States, and so indigenous culture. And the southwestern United States, we have a tradition also of eating pine nuts, which are very expensive because you got to get them out of this big woody cone, and they took several years in order to grow. But delicious. All right, when we look at not a pine, but we have these juniper or cypress shrub style, all right, we're also going to see that they have some reproductive structures on them, and they look a little different. So when we look at the immature cones that we see on juniper, they're actually called berries. They seem like they're fleshy, and they are, but they're actually immature cones, like that little blue one that was going to grow into that big oval-shaped pine cone. So we have some examples of pictures of what the reproductive structures of these shrubby pinophytes. All right, cycads. So cycads, there's not as much diversity. And the female cone is going to produce the seeds, and the male cone is going to produce the pollen, just like in a pine. The female cone is always going to be more of a rounded, flatter shape. The male cone that produces the pollen is going to be long and thin and tall. And I have some more pictures for you in the cycads tutorial. Remember that ginkgo phyte is another example of plant with seeds and pollen, but not flowers. So those reproductive structures that you're seeing on this plant are also cones. Doesn't matter what you think they look like, they are cones. All right, and finally for flowering plants, what does this look like? That we have the ovule is going to be at the base of the flower. And so we have this ovary is going to be the base of the flower, and the ovules are inside of it. So if you have a green pepper, the vegetable green pepper is actually a fruit, and that green part around the outside is the ovary, and those little white seeds that are inside of it, those are actually the ovules, because a green pepper is an immature pepper. And so it's only partway through its development. Those seeds aren't ready to plant, right? So we're going to have in the base of the flower, we're going to have the the ovary. Inside of them is going to be the ovule. Each ovule can have a fertilized egg, and those are going to grow into seeds. So as this fruit starts to grow, the flower is going to die, and then there's elongation or growth in size of the ovary. Right, so if you've never had a garden, you've never watched this, I have some pictures for you in the lab activities to see kind of how that happens. It's really sort of a weird thing. So remember that those ovules are going to become the seed. The seed has a developing embryo of a new sporophyte offspring inside of it. The ovary is going to become the fruit, right? If it's got seeds inside of it, it's an ovary and it's a fruit, right? So a green bean is an ovary. It's got seeds inside of it. It's a fruit. A tomato, it's got seeds inside of it. It's an ovary. It's a fruit. A zucchini has seeds inside of it. It's an ovary. It's a fruit. All right, so we define vegetables in the West as plant parts that aren't sweet typically, so they're not botanically representative, that word vegetable. It could be a celery stalk, it could be a tomato, and we define things that we call fruits like peaches and raspberries that are sweet. But botanically, if it came from the ovary of a flower, it's a fruit and has a seed inside of it. So each of those seeds has an embryo growing inside of it, but when the ovary matures and the seeds drop out of it, they're in a resting state. They're asleep, and they are going to wait until they get dispersed. They're going to wait until conditions are good for them to grow before they reawaken, reanimate, and come out of the seeds. And we'll talk more about what happens with flowering plants next slide.